Again, good morning, everyone. I'm glad I didn't scare you off with the information from last week's class. Um, I can assure you that today's will be as provocative. It occurred to me that uh, after last week's class, that the um, kind of information that I was presenting could easily leave it. I've never heard this before. Where's John getting this? And it leaves you in kind of a dumbstruck place. Well, as I mentioned, I knew none of this information either until, through my own research on Kennedy's coup d'etat, I discovered it, and then I began to read and found these source materials that are part of your syllabus right there. And of course, I know where this journey is going, and it will be shocking to you when we get there, both for the end of part one and for part two. I would simply, as I always try to do, is encourage you to read. So many of the sources that we rely on are not giving us the full story or the story at all, and that whether that's our media or whether it's schools or major leaders or cultural institutions. So many of them are reliant on an official story because it's not threatening. It's like settled history. And if we start stirring the waters, it's really uncomfortable for a lot of people. So I thank you for coming down the river with me on this journey. I know you'll find it fascinating because we get a glimpse of how things actually happen. But with that, anything from any of you before we set out for today? Okay, well, let me come down and begin to share my screen here.
Is there any, hi, good morning. Sorry to interrupt, but is there any way I can get the recording from the first session?
Yes, who is speaking, by the way?
This is Delina. Good morning,
Oh,
John.
Delina. Oh,
Great.
hi, Delina. Welcome.
Yes,
Yeah, Delina,
thank
I'll
you.
make sure that you get the recording from last week.
Alrighty. That might be
Oh,
the one that is not showing, the name is not showing up or showing up as iPhone.
okay, that's fine, Delina.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
bye-bye.
Um, so, as I mentioned, the course initially was titled Richard no, Nixon Resignation Reconsidered. But as I went deeper into this, I recognized what's really going on here is a silent coup against Richard Nixon. So that's the subtitle for this. And the story is much greater than what I thought it would be. So we'll do a part one that takes us up right through the break-in of June of 1972. And last week, briefly, we looked at how, as a precedent-setting event, the military were spying on the president because they didn't know what was going on with his foreign policy initiatives. They knew a little bit, but they didn't know the whole story, and they thought he was out of control. And they got caught, and it got shut down. Well, we're going to see in today's episode two how CIA infiltrated the White House for similar reason. And as I note, I like to take some of my titles either directly from movie or kind of a variant of them. So episode two here is some, not all, just some of the president's men. So off we go. But let me take a moment here if I can. I see there's something in the chat here. Let me see if there's anything I need to address there. Okay, that's from Sandra too. Okay, very good. Well, we're going to begin by talking about the golden boy who was serving the White House. But as I like to note right here, this is fool's gold if ever it was. Now, the first person I want to introduce is John J. Caulfield, who was a member of the NYPD and its Bureau of Special Services and Investigation. Essentially, this was their Red Squad in the NYPD. And no, he's not the golden boy. And then there is Anthony Ulazowicz, who also a 26-year veteran of NYPD, former NYPD, and also Red Squad. And no, not him either. I like to refer to Tony Ulazowicz as Tony, the face, Ulazowicz. And then, of course, there is something a little more Republican looking here. Herb Kalmbach, he was Nixon's personal attorney, but largely working out here in California. Now, he's going to play a key role with these other two gentlemen whom I just have mentioned here, but not just yet. We are getting warmer, but not quite, with Thomas Charles Houston, who at the time was a young White House attorney, just taking a walk there with the president outside the West Wing right there. Ah, here is the golden boy, John Dean III. Well, Dean was hired as counsel to the president in July of 70 to take over responsibilities that had been covered by John Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman had been moved up to the administration's #3 position as head of White House Domestic Council, which was intended to be equivalent to the National Security Council. Now, there were many people on the administrative staff who did not think that John Dean was the right choice. And boy, did they get that right. Dean had a really attractive look. He was coming out from the Treasury Department, where he was at. He was a Porsche driving, Italian suit, Gucci wearing, long hair for the time, for the administration, individual who H.R. Haldeman referred to as the administration's hippie. Now, he was anything but a hippie. He was a player. He liked to hit the singles bars, either in Los Angeles here or in Washington, D.C. Well, shortly after assuming his position as counsel to the president, he began to think about, how do I expand my domain here? Now, let me go back a little bit. You know, Dean, when he came out of law school, he was working in Washington for a firm that was handling licensing for cable companies. Cable industry was beginning to blossom tremendously in the late 60s, going into the 70s. And yet there were just a handful of law firms in Washington that could help with the licensure process. And Dean was working for one of these firms. And he thought, hey, I could make a little extra money if I do some moonlighting for one of these other firms. And he got caught by his original firm. Now, they could have seen to it that he was disbarred for this unethical behavior, but they just fired him and quietly moved him on. And he had a pretty good recovery from that, because he moved from private work into government work. And but the kind of ethics that John Dean exhibited in his first job, we'll see him showing in his job working for the White House. So here he is now counsel, and he's thinking, how do I grow my domain? He assessed the situation pretty clearly, and he could see that playing to the dark side of the president was the way to go. Intelligence gathering was key to power in the Nixon White House. And one of his first assignments, and it was given to him from Haldeman, was to look over the proposition or the proposal to revamp the government's domestic intelligence operation. Now, those are really banal words, but we all know what it means. It means spying on citizens and neutralizing those. And among the groups that the administration were going after were the Black Panthers and the Weathermen and others. Well, this is going to bring us back for just a moment here to Thomas Charles Houston. He looks innocent enough, huh? In June of 71, Nixon tried to get the intelligence agencies to cooperate. And when I say the intelligence agency, I mean this fruit salad of FBI, CIA, DIA, and we were talking a little bit more this morning, NSA. But the problem was these organizations didn't want anything to do with one another. They all had their own turf, they had all their own budgets, and they didn't want cooperation. Well, this young attorney, Houston, prepared an analysis and a plan of how the organizations could cooperate. And Hoover and the heads of the other intelligence agencies bought into it. It was a workable, inoffensive plan that didn't threaten their turf or their budgets. One thing to mention right here, this is again 1970, and the gentleman you see in the photograph here, director of the FBI, is 10 years past forced retirement. As you know, with JFK's bloody coup d'etat, Hoover managed to avoid mandatory retirement. He continued on under Johnson, and he's continuing on under Nixon, but he is losing his grip. And the administration really doesn't like working with Hoover, so they are always trying to find a way around Hoover. But Hoover had, a lock on that agency. And anything that came near his agents, he found out about. But in addition to this workable plan that Houston put together, he added his own secret memorandum that would become known as the Houston Plan. This is a little add-on. Houston was doing a little extra homework. And this Houston Plan called for essentially the shredding of our Bill of Rights, electronic surveillance, monitoring of American citizens by international communication facilities, relaxation of opening of our mail, entries into our places of business and our homes, recruitment of informants on the campuses, and to ensure that the objectives were carried out, the intelligence continued to be gathered. He suggested the formation of a new interagency group consisting of both federal and military intelligence. So that's how you handle rowdy American citizens. As I note here, it is a shredding of the Bill of Rights, specifically the Fourth Amendment. Now, I've heard Houston, Thomas Charles Houston, justify this plan of his, and he just felt that the American internal security was at such a threat in the early 1970s by all these domestic parties that it needed something as radical as this to deal with it. Our government, our nation is going to fall, from the breakfast program that the Panthers are offering in the Bay Area or down here in Los Angeles. Houston, ever the attorney, as I note here, rationalized the basis for why he was suggesting this. But in contrast to his initial analysis for cooperation among agencies, the Houston Plan angered Hoover, not because he objected coming down hard on dissidents, but rather because he felt that any new interagency group would encroach on the turf of the FBI and because he was concerned about the negative publicity should any of this be exposed. Hoover was becoming very, very cautious in his advanced years here. He had also taken note that the courts, the federal courts, were not looking kindly any longer on illegal wiretapping. So he knew that the climate had changed. Second individual, Attorney General John Mitchell, agreed with Hoover that the Houston plan should be stopped in its tracks, but not for the director's reasons. Rather, Mitchell said, get this, the plan was unconstitutional. How about that? And he told Nixon not to go forward with it. So that stopped the Houston plan. It seems to have been buried, along with, as we discussed last week, the Moore-Radford scandal. But a lot of things in Washington, D.C. are like zombies. They come back alive again. And that's what we're going to see with the Houston plan. Coordination of the official domestic intelligence that I mentioned at the outset was handed to the new White House counsel, John Dean. And lo and behold, they gave him a copy of the Houston plan. It's late summer of 71. The Houston plan is in its zombie state, but still floating around. Haldeman is pushing Dean to try and find a way around Hoover's roadblock of a new interagency group. And Haldeman could hold his breath forever, and that was never going to happen. But, he thought it was worth a go. Dean met with the Attorney General, trying to persuade him of this new interagency group to pursue domestic intelligence. But he added that this group should have, I love this banal term here, operational responsibilities. You know what that means. Anyway, Mitchell is interesting as a human being, as a professional. He often had a difficult time. When he really recognized something was wrong, he would say it straight up. But when he was unsure or not knowing who he's dealing with right there, he'd take a silent reaction to it. And that is sort of how he's responding to John Dean walking in with the Houston plan. He doesn't respond. He goes silent because he's learned that sometimes not answering will help kill the program, or in this case, it'll help languish. Dean is ambitious, and in his closet, he's got two people who were hired before his position by Ehrlichman when he was the White House counsel. And I'd introduced these gentlemen just a moment ago, Jack Caulfield and Tony, the Face Ulazewicz. So Dean, he's got a small closet of an office in the White House. He's got these two guys under him, and he's thinking, how can I use these guys to expand my domain? Well, he's going to figure it out. One of the things I'd mentioned last week, this whole story of Watergate has a lot of relationship to the way Hollywood studio financing works. And John Dean is very much like a young producer who's just gotten a one-picture deal, or he's got a housing deal on one of the studios, a first look deal, that's what I want to be. He's got a first look deal at one of the studios. So they're paying his rent, they've given him a secretary, and he's got to come up with a project that'll be greenlit if he's going to be around for 6 months or 12 months later. So that's what Dean is trying to do. He's trying to get a project and get it greenlit. And he's got these two guys, this two talent, working for him here. Now, he is later going to try and diminish his relationship with Caulfield and Ulazewicz, but he's going to lead them on several tasks for the president. And on these tasks, he's going to try and make his counsel's office grow into a small but ever-growing power center. During the May Day protests of 1971, I don't, anybody of you remember the May Day protests of 1971? You'll recall that in 67, 68, 67, 68, 69, and then particularly in 70 with the bombing campaign in Laos and Cambodia unearthed, there were a tremendous number of protests. May Day protests of 71 were also enormous, again, reacting to our policies in Southeast Asia. And Dean was out there with his forces gathering information about these American citizens coming to exercise their First Amendment rights. As the 1972 Republican convention approached, Dean is thinking, how can I leverage what I have just done into something more? How can I make me and my office more prominent in the president's mind? And I love this photograph of Dean right here. Here he is surveying his domain, looking over all the paperwork he has on his desk, and how can I turn this into some gold? Well, Dean submitted a plan to Haldeman that would transform his intelligence gathering, demonstrator intelligence gathering into what would be termed political intelligence, essentially widening the net of his responsibility. But Haldeman dismissed Dean. He already had an assistant, Gordon Strain, seen here in the photograph, Gordon Strawn, who was working on that. He didn't want Dean picking up that responsibility. He's already, I'll put it in the analogy of Hollywood again, he already had a producer working on that project. He didn't need Dean muscling in on that guy's territory. Well, undaunted, Dean devised a project to get his foot farther into the door. And on August 16th, he produced a memorandum, and you'll love this title, Dealing with Our Political Enemies, that addressed how to use federal machinery to screw their opponents. So just that language and that whole mindset, this is where it comes from, the Golden Boy. The Dean memo was the germ that led to what we will come to know as the president's enemies list. It first began as the Dean's enemy list. Now, although he'd later testified that he was a restraining influence and didn't want to become involved with the wild and crazy schemes, Dean was often the author of such wild and crazy schemes. He sought to get around Haldeman's prohibition of becoming involved in political intelligence, and to do so, he engaged Caulfield and Ulazewicz in a number of activities. The most prominent of these was the suggestion to Caulfield in November of 71 that he break into the headquarters of the DNC in the Watergate building. And Caulfield recalled, the more I thought about it, the more I saw the hazard. I'm sent on a disastrous mission here by this young fool. So he managed to avoid it, and there was no break-in at that time, but Caulfield knew that he had to address this demand from Dean. So what he did, he asked his partner, Ulazewicz, hey, Tony, just walk in, don't break in, just walk on in over to the DNC, make like a tourist, see what you can find out. And that's what Tony did. Goes in, checks out the offices, which occupied the entire 6th floor of the DNC, and he walked out. Ulazewicz afterwards told Dean, I don't know what you think is in that office. Something hot? It's not there. Well, at this time, Caulfield began to think about leaving the White House in order to set up a private detective business. I suspect he also was getting a little fed up working for Dean. He liked working for Ehrlichman, but Dean's a different producer. And he also thought maybe I can make a little more money in the private sector, but still serving the same client. And he offered to set up an outside entity that could provide security for the 1972 Nixon campaign and what will be the Republican convention in Miami. And he wrote up his suggestions in a memo to Dean, suggesting $500,000 to fund what he called Operation Sandwedge. Well, Sandwedge's offensive side, including some of the things we've already seen in the Houston plan, that is, penetration of nominees' entourage and headquarters, black bag capability to minimize Democratic voting violations in Illinois and Texas, and they probably had every right to be concerned about Illinois and Texas, considering the 1960 campaign, and derogatory information investigative capability worldwide. So it was sort of Houston plan light. Dean tried to sell the Sandwedge to Mitchell and Haldeman, but both of them rejected it. It was like, hey, I got this new script from one of these talent that's been working under me. What do you think? Can we get the green light on this? But they passed on the project. Well, having struck out with these senior people, Dean's a very ambitious young man, like a very ambitious producer who's got a ticking clock on his position there. He drops down a level and he begins pushing the Sandwedge proposal to Gordon Strachan and Jeb Magruder, a name we will hear a lot of as we move forward. Dean once again found no takers, however, for the Caulfield proposal. Well, like we saw before, as an alternative, Dean arranged with have Caulfield have an interview with Mitchell. Maybe you don't like the project, the script here, but how about if I send in the screenwriter? Maybe there's something that he has that you'll like. But Mitchell, he's not going to be I'll use the analogy, he's leaving the attorney general position. He's taking a new position to become head of the re-election campaign. And this is the last person you want to be trying to sell a script to. He's leaving the studio, but he's going to work for, if you will, a competitive studio. Mitchell, however, didn't like Caulfield. So the Sandwedge project was DOA once again. But Dean, and we'll see this behavior a lot moving forward, he will use this meeting between Caulfield and Mitchell that he set up to effectively shift responsibility for initiating intelligence gathering activities to Mitchell and exculpate himself. This is all about Mitchell. It wasn't about me. Mitchell's the one trying to do this stuff. Well, Dean, he's going to smear Mitchell as we see going forward. So while Sandwedge has been rejected by Mitchell, like we saw with the Houston plan, it began to have this zombie life as the continued operations conducted by Caulfield and Ulazewicz. And typically, if you can't get funded at the price that you were asking, hey, you knock it down a little bit. And they knocked it down quite a bit. How about something at the $50,000 range? So I use the analogy of movie me. They went in trying to get a B picture financed. They got turned away, so they came in with a project that was a D picture, trying to get that financed. Dean himself was involved in getting Ulezewicz's contract extended through 72. He didn't want to lose this talent in his office, and he did so by renegotiating a continuation with Herb Kalmbach. Dean is very clever. When he can't get something done in DC, he knows there's an there's a presidential office out in California with a budget of their own. That's Herb Kalmbach. So he goes to Herb Kalmbach and he managed to keep Ulazewicz around by getting money from him. Dean would later testify that Mitchell was the action officer for Caulfield-Ulazewicz team. How can I put this nicely? This was not true. Dean lies up one side and down the other when it's convenient for him. In fact, the president's private eyes, Caulfield and Ulazewicz, were the gumshoes of the White House counsel, John Dean. And I know I'm really getting a lot of mileage out of this photograph of Dean here with his Gucci loafer. Although I have to tell you, those do not look like Gucci loafers, the soles of Gucci loafers to me. But there it is. Oh, good. Enter G. Gordon Liddy, where Sandwedge becomes Gemstone. Well, Caulfield, as noted here, he had a desire to leave the White House, and this combined with the rejection of Operation Sandwich, his movie, was a large blow to Dean, because he's losing the screenwriter and the project. And he's got to get something happening or he's going to be off the studio lot. Dean had the resources to continue gathering information on his own, but he had to have a replacement for Caulfield. An opportunity presented itself in the form of G. Gordon Liddy. Time for full disclosure. Now, I don't know if any of you recognize this wonderful photograph here. This is a photograph from the 80s, and the gentleman on the right is none other than Timothy Leary. And the gentleman with that, I love that open shirt and medallion and those aviator shades, is a reformed, rechanged G. Gordon Liddy. The two of them had been on the lecture circuit, and Timothy Leary had really chilled out G. Gordon Liddy by this time. And this is when I came into contact with G. Gordon Liddy. He played a lead role in a movie. It was shot in '88 and released in '90. I was the screenwriter on this project. Here you see the VHS box artwork for it at that time. Street Asylum. This cop is not losing his mind. It's being taken from him. And Liddy played a Daryl Gates-like chief of police who was running for mayor. And as I note right here, when I knew Liddy, it was in the late '80s here, he had a sense of humor about himself. He was good to know. However, this is the Liddy of 1971. And I must tell you, when he came in to work for them, he wasn't wearing this giant mustache. He grew that later on. But among his other occupations, he'd been an attorney, special agent for FBI, and a firearms expert for the Treasury Department. And this is really what his expertise was at. But he was looking to make a lateral move in the government. And he moved from Treasury to the White House in June of '71 to work for Eagle Crow. Now, we talked about Eagle Crow last week. He's one of the plumbers, along with David Young on the Special Investigative Unit, okay? And Liddy started working with the Special Investigative Unit at a really crucial time. The Pentagon Papers had just been published in various newspapers across the nation. As I noted, the disclosures had nothing to do with the Nixon administration or with Henry Kissinger, but they became enraged and they went to hunt down who leaked these. And when they found out it was Daniel Ellsberg, Kissinger, for whom Ellsberg was his protege, he found that very threatening. And he called him the most dangerous man in America. And Mr. President, we have to get him. So fearing that his own role in shaping Vietnam policy would be revealed, Kissinger convinced Nixon that publication of these documents were a grave threat to national security. And when it was discovered that the papers were given to the press by Ellsberg, he became furious and became intent on discrediting Ellsberg. A campaign to discredit Ellsberg was launched from the Oval Office right by Kissinger himself. And again, time for full disclosure. I knew Dan Ellsberg. I dramatized a production of Pentagon Papers for several theaters in the Los Angeles area back in 2011 and 2012. And Ellsberg called it an excellent condensation of the Pentagon Papers. So Don Stewart, who we encountered last week, and Fred Buzzard, also from last week, they're over at the Pentagon, and others at the Justice Department. All of them are working on this Pentagon Papers leak. David Young, Eagle Crow of SIU, are also looking into it. And when Liddy came on board, he was assigned to the task. And this is going to bring in the subject of infiltration. But before I do that, let me see if there's any questions that are in the house here at this time. So does anybody have anything you want to add or comment on what I've mentioned so far?
John.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Well, go ahead, Ken.
My question is, this is I know pivotal to the whole Nixon resignation. Did Nixon know all this was going on?
No. This is all, and he didn't want to know this stuff. This is,
Yeah.
he had people working for him. This was their responsibility to hire the staff for these things here. So the hiring of John Dean in White House counsel, that probably came up to the level of Haldeman. Maybe Ehrlichman was brought into it, but Haldeman eventually is the one that gave the go on that. The people that had worked under Ehrlichman, President didn't know Ulazewicz or Caulfield. Those were all hires that Ehrlichman had made when he was White House counsel. Houston, go ahead.
Would you say that Nixon created the environment that allowed for this kind of behavior?
I think that there is some people that say, yes, that Nixon is responsible for this environment, but I think others would say absolutely not. Nixon, as I mentioned last week, was a bifurcated human being. He had a light side and he had a dark side. He wanted to be joyous and happy and working toward good things, but he was also fearful and threatened, and he was willing to strike first and strike harder before they get me. I got to get them before they get me. And there were people around in the White House that could play to his dark side. Among them, and this isn't all the time, but among the people that knew to take advantage of this was Charles Colson. John Dean is recognizing this is the way to move up the food chain in the White House by playing to Nixon's dark side. And the chief responsibility of Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman were to keep people like that away from the president. Not to get anywhere close to him. But of course, they found a way, they couldn't be on guard all the time, and they would sneak in.
John, don't you think that Nixon would, if you said that I think a very key point, he was a hands-off kind of guy. He said, I'm president, I'll leave that to my chief of staff. They'll do that. I'm going to deal with the bigger issues. While this wound, he created this environment to create this festering infection over here. And it just continued to grow. And he didn't want to know about it.
Exactly.
It was his chief of staff and his underlings. Would you say that that's how he managed that whole?
Absolutely. He was the big thinker. He's the one coming into office with this fully formed foreign policy to, détente with Soviet Union?
Yeah.
Can I open up a bridge to People's Republic of China? Can I make Southeast Asia go away? This is what he was
Yeah.
trying to do.
Yeah, he had the grand scheme. He didn't want to get into the minutia down here. That's
Right.
walking in the mud. Let the other
Right.
people, the small people walk in the mud. Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
There was something else that you had just mentioned, though, Bob, that triggered a thought there, but I can't pick it up. But thank you for mentioning that. He wanted to stay above the fray, and these were administrative matters that his staff was to deal with. He also was a horrible people person. He was so uncomfortable around people. And this, when you read or listen to interviews for people who worked for him, this is what will always come forward. I had very little contact with the president, and when I did, it was really awkward. He didn't know how. He was the most unusual person I've ever encountered because he didn't have good people skills. And that's among the reasons why he was kept in his little domain and where he could do what he did best. And Haldeman and Ehrlichman, often referred to as the Berlin Wall, because both of them had those Germanic surnames, they were the ones that were filtering the people that coming forward or taking ideas that the president wanted to do and having it implemented by the different individuals. The other thing that Nixon did, he took away all the power away from his cabinet members. Under Johnson and particularly Kennedy, a lot of those cabinet people held a great deal of, power. They could speak on their own. But Nixon took all of that away. They were just figureheads.
Yeah,
Everything had to be cleared through the Oval Office.
yeah, they were the mud walkers. They'd walk
Right,
through
right.
the line of hill.
Right.
But I just am going to veer off for a minute. But
Go ahead.
remember in 1972 when the Robert Preston Huey helicopter landed on the White House lawn? He was there. Well, was one of the guys to go in and recover that aircraft. And he was
Who's he?
Nixon. He looked out and he got very paranoid and went back in, and it was an interesting week there being around the White House.
Yeah, to have seen that kind of behavior up close and personal as you did.
Yeah, it was interesting. It's just very, you would think somebody would want to know more about it, but he was, he had people coming out asking questions, go back and feed to him. It was really funny. Anyway,
Yeah.
Just an aside.
No, it's while it may seem like an aside, it really is. It helps us understand who this individual is, and we'll get more along the way. I'll give more personal or revelations about Nixon as a human being.
Right.
Well,
That
I have-
is perfect. Go ahead, Kathy.
I have one more question. What was it that Liddy was hired for specifically?
He was hired to be an investigator
Investigator.
within the White House counsel office because Caulfield was going away.
Okay,
And John Dean wanted to replace him. So
Okay.
Liddy was brought in for that. And because he was a lawyer, he had been working for the FBI at one time, and he was a firearms expert for the Treasury Department. Among the things, and that was very uncomfortable for Liddy in the Treasury Department is because he was an outspoken member of that department for the Fourth Amendment. He was an advocate for gun policy or for gun ownership. And you may or may not recall, in the 70s, there was a greater effort to have gun control. And Liddy was such an outsider on that policy,
Right.
because he was outspoken for gun ownership. So the Treasury Department was kind of happy to see him go away. And he ended up in working for the counsel's office under John Dean.
So he was actually with the ATF over in Treasury then.
Yep.
Yeah. So that,
Yep.
Okay.
Mutis.
Okay. Thanks.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, as I note here, infiltration, this is what I had alluded to at the opening, infiltration, what we're going to witness now is infiltration by the CIA of the White House. And the big joke is nobody ever retires from the CIA. Nixon's preoccupation with domestic intelligence and counterintelligence, that is both his effort to leak and stop the leaks, was noticed by the CIA. Under then Director of Central Intelligence, Richard Helms, seen in the photograph here with the president, CIA began to infiltrate the Special Investigative Unit, the plumbers who had been tasked with covering these leaks. Led by David Young and Eagle Crow, again, we met last week, SIU was very effective in solving a huge scandal just 6 months earlier, or months earlier, the Moore Radford spy scandal. Once they knew about that thing, they got right on it, shut it down, but buried it. They didn't want the public to know about it. However, once Liddy had been added to the team, however, it became vulnerable. We'll see Liddy kind of serving in two different capacities, sort of a swing man. He serves for the counsel's office, and he also comes over and he does work for the Special Investigative Unit. And Liddy, under Liddy, SIU will become vulnerable. Liddy, because of his intelligence background, did not question people from his profession who came looking for work. Liddy was, at this time, was mistrustful of everybody except somebody who was in law enforcement. Well, they must be a good guy. And one day, E. Howard Hunt came looking for work. Hunt initially began working in the White House through old school ties. He had contacted Brown University alum Charles Colson after Colson was hired by the White House and was bugging him for a job. And eventually, Colson was able to bring Hunt on board. And a short time later, however, Hunt sought a lateral move. So he infects the White House through Colson, and then he begins making a lateral move to a more vulnerable place. He contacts Liddy. Liddy, the note here, an ex-FBI man, accepted Hunt's cover story that he was, I'm ex-CIA, I'm retired now, I'm all out of that. Well, the story on E. Howard Hunt, retirement in the CIA is nothing but a cover story to go do something else and then come back. Hunt had retired twice before and carried out, activities for the CIA and then was back on the payroll again. As I said here, no one ever leaves CIA except as part of a cover story. So with Hunt hired, Liddy suggested working up a psychological profile of Daniel Ellsberg, to understand his motivation. And if we understand his motivation, maybe we can understand some potential weaknesses. And guess what? Hey, I'm in the CIA, or I was in the CIA. They do great workups. We could go over there and they'll give us a CIA analyst to do a psychological workup of Dan Ellsberg. Hey, in fact, I bet you I can go over there and I can get 2 of them. And that's what he did. But guess what? Both of those workups were absolutely useless because they didn't have any information on Dan Ellsberg. And Dan Ellsberg had high-level clearances because he had been such an effective member of the Defense Department and the State Department in the years before. He had sterling credentials. However, Liddy found out that Ellsberg recently been seeing a psychiatrist in Beverly Hills. Maybe we can get some information from his doc. But guess what? Hunt said, let's take it a step further. Why don't we even bother with the doc? Let's just break in and take his file. So instead of an interview or some other unobtrusive activity with Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Hunt proposed a break-in to view and copy the information in his file. So you can see very quickly the effect that Hunt had on the SIU team led, or this portion of it led by G. Gordon Liddy right here. Going outside their realm by turning to the CIA, which of course is telling the CIA, guess what we're interested in? And by saying, let's go in and do a felonious break-in, a black bag job. It was hoped that Fielding's files might contain information on Ellsberg's motivations and contacts. And to his everlasting detriment, Liddy agreed. And then he put together a proposition and took it up to his boss right here, one of his bosses, Eagle Crow, to okay just such an operation. And Crow, to his detriment, this was Eagle Crow. You know, the gag on Eagle Crow is they used to call him Evil Crow because it was the last thing that he was. This guy was such a Boy Scout. Anyway, a memo went from Crow and his partner Young to Ehrlichman to recommend that a covert operation be undertaken to examine all the medical files still held by Ellsberg's psychoanalyst, covering the 2-year period in which he was undergoing. And this is Ellsberg's psychiatrist right here. This is Dr. Lewis Fielding. A space was provided for Ehrlichman to approve or disapprove, and to his everlasting regret, he put an E in the approve box and added a handwritten comment, if done under your assurance, this is not traceable. Remember that wonderful phrase we picked up before, plausible deniability? That's what they're looking for. Ehrlichman admitted checking the box, but he said that what he approved was merely an investigation of Ellsberg by Liddy and Hunt, not a burglary. It was his understanding that Liddy and Hunt would go and talk to Fielding. Boy, did he get that wrong. Hunt and Liddy, as he directed, you're not to pass yourselves off as White House cops, but that is exactly what these two guys were looking to do. Guess what? Hunt assembled a break-in team. So just as he turned to the CIA for workups, psychoanalytic workups. He turned to them for disguises, and he's also turning to 3 former CIA assets who he had trained 10 years earlier in the Bay of Pigs operation. And these are Bernard Barker, Eugenio Martinez, and Felipe de Diego. So you can see CIA is all over this operation. Through Hunt, CIA has totally infected the plumbers and hence the highest levels of the White House. The break-in, now they did a casing operation that was just Hunt and Liddy, and they wore these ridiculous CIA-provided disguises. And they managed to talk a cleaning woman to let them go in and just look around, and then they were escorted out. And they've come back a second time with a team, and the building is locked. So they are going to do a great deal of damage trying to get in. And as I said, it is a foul up from the outset, but as I determined, it is an intentional foul up. Instead of carefully entering and unobtrusively locating and photographing Ellsberg's file, the team just tore apart the doctor's office. Liddy stayed outside. He was the watchman. And Hunt and his CIA team ransacked the doctor's office and the file cabinet. They took a crowbar in there and they just ripped that place apart. You can see the evidence of it. The photograph here is of the locked file cabinet. Now, allegedly, they did not find Ellsberg's file, but guess what? It was later found to be wide open. Hunt and his team used the cameras, get this, supplied by the CIA to record information, but get this, the film could not be extracted from the cameras for development. Since these were CIA cameras, they had to be turned back to the CIA, and it alone would retrieve the images. Well, needless to say, this black bag operation gave the SIU nothing on which to proceed against Ellsberg. However, it turned the SIU and Ehrlichman, who had approved the activity, into felony lawbreakers, all at the hands of CIA. Oh, and by the way, Felipe de Diego would later say that, yeah, I did photograph the Ellsberg file. I found it and I shot it with the CIA camera, but we never acknowledged the results. Now, Liddy, understandably, was angry and frustrated with this Beverly Hills break-in. But despite his feelings, he didn't understand that he was being played by CIA. In contrast, Ehrlichman realized the jeopardy into which he had been placed, but there was nothing he could do about it now except keep quiet. Now we're going to enter another area, and some of you may have heard this term, gemstone. This is where the Houston Plan becomes the Sedgwick Plan, becomes the gemstone plan. Nothing ever dies. It just takes on a zombie life. Well, it was at this time that John Dean was being pressured by Jeb Magruder, seen here in the photograph, and his position is deputy campaign director. Jeb Magruder serves directly under John Mitchell, who is now moved out of the AG's office across the street, and he's working in the campaign headquarters in DC. And Jeb Magruder is pushing Dean to give up one of his assistants, of attorney Fred Fielding, no relationship to Lewis Fielding, Ellsberg's psychiatrist. So he could become general counsel to the re-election committee. They're pilfering each other's staff to staff up their own departments and their own operations. Dean didn't want to lose Fielding, so he countered with the suggestion that the committee take David Young from SIU. But guess what? Crow doesn't want his man poached either. So Crow refused to give up his partner, and Crow instead suggested to Dean that the proper candidate was this other former attorney, G. Gordon Liddy. So Crow set up a meeting between Dean and Liddy to discuss a job with the committee to re-elect the president, the CRP. In the meeting, Liddy recounted that Dean said that both he and Caulfield might be required to go into the closet for a while, to create for the campaign an absolute first-class intelligence operation. And you've got to believe this was music to Liddy's ear. He loves being the spy guy. So Dean knew how to play him. Sandwich? Liddy asked. Dean encouraged him to think bigger than sandwich, and he gave him a copy of the plan, however. And Dean says when he gives him the plan, sandwich has been judged inadequate. So you'll have a pretty good idea of what you'll have to come up with to be adequate. So again, I'll use my analogy of the movie studio. They had this script that had been turned down by two other entities, but he gives it to this new talent here. We either can consider Liddy as a director or a screenwriter. Let's think of him as a screenwriter actor. And if you can take this script, but make it your own and buff it up, and we can take that in, we'll get the green light on that. And Dean mentioned, this is a $500,000 picture here. But Liddy said, no, Liddy knew what he was doing. This isn't a $500,000 project. This is $1 million project. And Liddy quotes Dean as saying, no problem. Let's go for $1 million. It's just so much like movies, I have to tell you. And a young producer trying to get a project going. Anyway, it's not certain what Crow thought of the meeting with Dean and Liddy, and indeed, did he even know anything about it at all, because Dean just makes stuff up. But afterwards, Dean and Liddy come out of that and they meet with Mitchell to discuss legal matters. Because remember, what they're really trying to sell Liddy on is moving out from SIU and beginning to work as counsel for the committee to re-elect for the president. And they've sold him on that so long as he get to play the spy game. So they took Liddy in to meet the head of the campaign, Mitchell. And Mitchell's happy with Liddy, but he wants to discuss the legal things that he's going to be tasked for doing as the new CRP attorney. Well, at that meeting, there was so much to discuss on matters, legal matters, there was no time to go over the last item on the agenda, which was all about intelligence. And that's why Liddy took this position. And he was so upset that had never been discussed that he pressed Dean for word on whether there would be a further meeting to discuss what I understood would be my principal mission, intelligence, the spy game. That's why I came over here. I don't want to be a lawyer. I'm going to be a lawbreaker. Anyway, according to Liddy, Dean ordered him to start as soon as possible on a plan that could be submitted to Mitchell. This rewriting of the sandwich at $1 million. Well, with the help of Hunt, surprise, surprise, and mindful of the $1 million budget that Dean had said there'd be no problem, Liddy let his imagination loose. And guess what? With Hunt's connections over to the CIA, they went back over to the CIA to have them create some visuals to sell the project. Liddy called his plan, or his movie, Gemstone, starring Michael Douglas and Kathleen Turner. The plan contained infiltration, once again, shredding of the Bill of Rights, Democratic campaign infiltration, electronic eavesdropping, use of prostitutes to compromise Democrats. Boy, is that going to come back. Counter demonstrations, sabotage of air conditioning units at the convention hall, and clandestine entries at campaign headquarters. Anyway, January 27th, 1972, 2 months after Dean had stirred Liddy to begin work on a plan, Liddy presented his scheme together with charts, as I noted, professionally drawn by Hunt's CIA cohort. So here's CIA once again in there, to a group gathered in the Attorney General's office. And we're often reference this meeting, January 27th, that had Mitchell, Magruder, and Dean. And when he questioned later, Mitchell characterized Liddy's imaginative plan as a complete horror story. It's as if, hey, I wanted a political thriller and you brought in a horror movie. I told him to go burn the charts. This was not what we were interested in. What we're interested in was a matter of information gathering and protection against demonstrators. We're not looking for lawbreakers. Well, when the meeting ended, Liddy again castigated Dean for not having supported him after he had given him every reason and $1 million budget figure to believe that Mitchell wanted this project. Well, Dean and Magruder both mollified Liddy by suggesting, okay, let's just cut the budget in half. Maybe it's the money issue. We'll get it back down to the sandwich side and we'll try again. So they go back in to see Mitchell a week later, February 4th, in a meeting with the same cast of characters, and Liddy did the same thing. Mitchell, again, going to give the silent treatment, looked at the papers that Liddy brought in and said, I'll have to think about it. He knew it was the same old rehash of what he had just rejected, so he was going to give it a soft pass. Dean then cut in, however, because he could see this, his airplane going down in flames. In a grandstanding gesture, he shot Liddy down in mid-flight, interrupting the presentation with the observation, "This is not a fit subject matter to be decided in the office of the Attorney General." But that decision would have to come from a completely unofficial channel. So Mitchell had not quite left yet the AG's office, so they're still meeting in there, and they're talking about law breaking, all because Dean had suggested it, and now Dean becomes the saint. Needless to say, Liddy left the meeting angry and frustrated. He'd been sabotaged by his co-partner here. Dean allegedly reports to Haldeman what had happened. And he's saying to Haldeman, this was incredible, unnecessary, and just so unwise. And having obtained Haldeman's agreement on this point, Dean allegedly said, I'm going to have no further dealing on this matter. But guess what? Haldeman has no memory of this meeting with Dean, which would have exculpated Dean. We're going to see this behavior. Dean creates meetings where there are none, and he changes the reporting on what the meeting was about when they are on the record. When he reviewed his office files, office logs after the event, and Haldeman kept very good logs, he will realize that no such meeting with Dean ever occurred. Dean made it up. Liddy, he returns to work for the CRP. He's disgruntled. This is never going to take off. I was brought over here to do spy work, and I'm stuck doing legal work for the CRP, and I'm under this wimp, Jeb Magruder. He took on several campaign investigations, but he continued just to grow angry and frustrated because Magruder gave him no independence on what he did best. However, with the appointment of Maurice Stans as finance director of the committee to re-elect, Liddy saw an opportunity to get out from underneath Magruder and to serve as Stans' general counsel. Yeah, shot ahead there a little bit. Opposition to losing Liddy entirely from the intelligence operation, however, came suddenly. They weren't giving Liddy any rope, but they didn't want to lose him. And it came from the White House. Both Dean and Strawn did not want to lose Liddy to Gordon Stans. Strawn went to Magruder, urged him to put aside his personal feelings toward Liddy. Magruder was deathly afraid of Liddy. There's a famous anecdote, I don't know whether it was true or not, when Magruder put his arm around Liddy when they were in an elevator, and Magruder took his hand up, you put your arm around me again, I'm going to rip it off and beat you to death with it. Now, whether that happened or not, it sure sounds like G. Gordon Liddy, but it's all just noise with G. But with a softy like Magruder, it sure went over. Because they needed someone like Liddy, in their intelligence gathering program. And he was their #1 professional in that area. So Magruder assented. It was agreed that Liddy should be transferred to the Finance Committee, understands, but continue to report to Magruder as our intelligence chief. Now, soon Magruder, under pressure from Dean and Strawn, told Liddy to try and formulate a third intelligence plan, and even with an even further reduced budget that they could again present to Mitchell. So they're trying to placate Liddy, and they're trying to get this little movie off the ground. And they think if we cut it down to, $250,000, we can get it the green light. March 30th, 1972, important meeting in Key Biscayne. At the meeting were Mitchell, Magruder, and Fred LaRue. Fred LaRue's an oil man who is a longtime confidant of John Mitchell. He and Mitchell were very close. While there were many items on the agenda in advance of the Republican convention coming up in Miami, the most consequential subject was held to the end, Gemstone. Now, Liddy, as I noted, had been transferred to Maurice Stan's Finance Committee, but if Gemstone was approved, he would have intelligence responsibilities to Magruder. Now, while there were various memories about what happened regarding Gemstone at this meeting, it seems that Mitchell made no decision. I'll repeat, Mitchell made no decision about whether or not to go forward with this reduced intelligence program. But what had started out as $1 million was now being proposed at $250,000. Magruder was being pressured by Dean at the White House to have Gemstone improved. Dean needs this movie to take off or he's going to lose. On the other hand, Mitchell, while not rejecting it, out of hand, was non-committal. And look what happens. What likely happens is that Magruder, getting pressure from Dean, gave the committee to re-elect the president's go-ahead to fund the scaled-down Gemstone without Mitchell's approval, using funds that were already under Magruder's control. So Magruder had a little pot of money off to the side for special projects, and he gave the go-ahead. Magruder, however, did not contact Liddy to inform him. As I said, he was deathly afraid of Liddy. He had his assistant, Bob Reisner, make the phone call. Well, Liddy, he's happy to get the go-ahead because it means that he would now begin to take action against the Democrats at their forthcoming convention in Miami. I'll make this clear. All of this illegal activity was focused on Miami and the convention. From the program's inception, that was the target. There was no mention of anything else. By that, I mean the DNC at the Watergate. While swamped with other business, that is collecting major cash donations, and this is where we'll get into later, they've got a certain deadline coming up where they can collect money without having to report its source. After that date, under new campaign re-election law, they're going to have to report where this money is coming from. So you've got all these rainmakers going around trying to collect money, and they're passing it on to people like Liddy, who are moving it on to Maurice Stans. This will prove consequential when we are in episode 4. Liddy, now that he's got the go-ahead, he goes off to see Hugh Sloan Jr. with his $250,000 intelligence budget now approved, and he's going to ask for $83,000 of it. Sloan is going to peel off 830 $100 bills, all in sequential order. And this is going to prove costly. Liddy gave $30K of the $83K to, here we go again, ex-CIA officer James McCord to buy electronic transmission equipment. But this is going to beg the question, who's James McCord Jr.? Well, I like to say, Liddy never knew what hit him. In the aftermath of the botched Beverly Hills break-in, Dr. Lewis Fielding's office, Jack Caulfield was asked to find someone capable of handling technical security for the CRP. Caulfield, whose connections were with the NYPD's Red Squad, had no one to offer, so he turned to a colleague, Secret Service agent Alfred Wong, who we see in the photograph here. Now, it's worth noting that Alfred Wong and his team of Secret Service agents were responsible for reinstalling the vast taping system for the president at the beginning of 1971. You may recall that when Nixon first came into office, he made a big show of having the taping system that Lyndon Johnson had in place removed. And then he left it that way for about 2 years, and then he quietly had a new taping system reinstalled. And this is the gentleman who oversaw it, Alfred Wong. Caulfield told Wong that he was seeking a Secret Service veteran with extensive security experience, as well as being a Republican with demonstrated loyalty to Nixon. That's his criteria, all of those things. Now, there could have been dozens of men who could have met this criteria, but Wong said, hey, I got nobody for you. But I do have an alternative, a guy named James McCord. Well, McCord was ex-CIA, not Secret Service. He ostensibly had retired from CIA at 19 years to earn more money. And although there was no demonstrated loyalty to Nixon, he was a registered Republican, for what that's worth. Under pressure, Caulfield hired McCord. And as we will see, big mistake. And McCord began working as a part-time employee of the Committee to Re-elect the President. He was never subjected to a background check by Nixon's men. And boy, are they going to pay for that. If they had checked, they would have discovered that McCord worked in the Office of Security, that's OS, for the CIA, an office tasked for rooting out moles. And not only that, McCord worked within the inner sanctum of the Office of Security, the Security Research Staff. This guy was so high level, so sequestered within the CIA, you couldn't even see him. He was not the incompetent flunky that many seek to characterize him. While in the CIA OS division, all of McCord's reports went directly to the DCI, Richard Helms. This guy was connected. Oh, and another thing, Hunt and McCord, often characterized as strangers, they knew one another from their experience in CIA 10 years earlier. Hunt and McCord were both involved with the training of the Cuban counter-revolutionaries in preparation for Operation Bay of Pigs. And so often the official story tells us these guys didn't know each other, and how different that is. In April, Hunt and McCord began working for Liddy under SIU in a plan for infiltrating the Democratic Convention. But this is a plan that would never take place. But what had taken place was an infiltration of the White House. by the CIA. Hunt and McCord were now working for SIU, an inner compartment of Nixon's secret government. And that's where our story will lead next week. So, before I leave our display, I'll show you a aerial photograph so we'll understand some of these buildings here. You can see the Watergate complex was really a housing complex of condominiums, but within the center there was a hotel, there was an office building, and directly across the street is a Howard Johnson's. All of those three buildings, the Howard Johnson's, the office building, and the hotel, will be consequential in the next 2 episodes. Okay, let me stop my share of episode 2 presentation right here and engage in conversation with you. So I find my cursor here. There we go. All right, everyone. How about that, huh?
I guess all this, what's the big deal? What were they going for?
They want to know what's up. Because the president has kept them outside the loop of information. That's why the military has been spying on him through the JCS liaison office, which we discussed last week. And the CIA wants to know what's going on with the White House. When Hunt first came over to work under Chuck Colson, you know, as ostensibly he's retired, he was sending back weekly reports to the CIA on what was happening in the office. They want to know.
But what was it with the Democratic Party offices? What were they looking to get there?
Well,
President.
that's where we're going, Kathy.
Oh, okay.
And you know, I tipped my hand a little bit, but I don't want to give a big spoiler. You're going to have so much fun over the next 2 weeks on what they are. See, that's the official story. It tells us they're going for some information or they're going for something, but it is so scandalous.
Okay.
I think we need a flow chart to follow all these people and who they're connected to.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and that's why, you know, I give the dramatis personae and keep that handy. It helps us to understand who these people are in relationship to where we're encountering them along the way here.
Yep.
And all of them are going to get caught up in the larger story of Watergate here in one fashion or another, deservedly or not. So many of these people had no reason to be pulled into this thing, but they were all tainted by it.
Mhm.
And the one person who escaped from it is the one person who got it all going, John Dean.
Right.
We'll get, you know, you'll see that over the next 2 episodes.
But didn't his career take a hit after this, though? Even though he didn't, you know, there was no mud slung at him on this, but his career really tanked after he left the DC area.
Well, he was disbarred, and what
Yes,
he
was.
did a number of things. One, he became an author, and so he's got a big publishing career. And he also became an investment broker. And one other thing, he's got, I'll call it a traveling show, but he's linked up with an author and publisher named James Robinall. And they go around the country doing it's those, I can't think of the initials, but for attorneys who annually have to do classes to keep their licensure in place, John Dean and James Robinall go around doing classes together. And I mean, I think they do like something 150 classes a year.
I thought,
Yeah. And he lives out here on the west side of LA here. As I said, he occasionally shows up at some cultural events that my brother attends, and he sees the two of them together. He and his wife Maureen.
Mm.
Yeah.
Hello.
Go ahead. Anyone
Yeah,
else?
can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead, Delano.
Yeah, my whole thing is the surprise and the shock about John Dean's role in all of this, but also I'm questioning, since
there are so many people that witnessed and that were manipulated by him, it seems, based on your account. Why didn't they speak up since they all had to go to jail? All the Plovers had to go to jail. Couldn't they have all talked about John Dean's role? Or did he make it so that he was so cushioned that they couldn't, you used that term plausible deniability. Could he have used that?
That's a wonderful question, Delina. But as we go through the next two episodes, you will see exactly how John Dean spun his web. And when we do part 2 of this course, and because what will happen, John Dean will be brought in by the the federal prosecutors, by Sirica, and really the FBI, and he wants to make a deal. And they said, we don't need you to make a deal. We've covered this all on our own. What his attorney goes back to him, he says, if you want immunity from them, you've got to find some way to bring in Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Nixon. And that's what Dean sets about doing. And we'll get to that in the second half of this course. But you will see how Dean manipulates the situation. And we saw a little bit of it today, but you're really going to see it in episodes 3 and 4 of part 1.
All right, can't wait.
Yep. Anybody else?
No, another good class.
All right. Margaret, how about you? Unmute, baby. Unmute. Unmute.
I'm just wondering, like, this is another side to the story, you know, that all along we've been sort of knowing about. And I wonder if you can never really know what went on unless you're actually there. And so I'm just thinking about, I'm a little skeptical. Like, why do the people that you've read, you know, that's actually what happened? Yeah. Or is it something in between? So that's like really what I'm just kind of thinking about now.
Good.
You know?
Very good, Margaret. And, you know, so I've provoked you. And what I'm
for sure.
Beautiful.
Yes.
Okay. So when this part 1 is over with, if that provocation still resides, go pick up, you know, Secret, you know, The Silent Coup by Len Kolodny. And because everything that he and his partner, Bob Gitlin, they just source all of where they get this information from. And I'll tell you what happened. Their book is 30 years old. So they had the benefit of waiting until so many of these participants in the story wrote their own books. And they also had access to the public record. And they went and they made comparisons between what this person said then and what they wrote in their book versus these other things. And they are the ones that are drawing these really clear, bright lines that are benefited by time and having all of the source material before them. And that's why I'm persuaded by their argument going forward in this. And when we're done here, pick up his book, Silent Coup, their book, Silent Coup. And I think you'll be persuaded the way I am. Okay. All right, everyone, we've gone a little bit over our time. Thank you for being here. Sandra, thank you very much for being with us and recording and sending this out. And for all of you, we look forward to being with you next Monday, and we'll continue our way down the river.